Name the kings of 50s country music. You'll say Hank Williams, maybe Johnny Cash. But what if I told you that you've forgotten the man who actually ruled the decade? His name was Webb Pierce. He was a god with silver dollar-lined cars and a guitar-shaped swimming pool. His chart success dwarfed everyone. So how could a king that visible simply vanish? Why was his name buried beneath the very flash he created? This is not just the story of a forgotten star. It is an autopsy of a legacy, an investigation into how a man can win the world but lose the war against time. To find the root of Webb Pierce's almost desperate need for attention, you have to go back to the damp, dusty lowlands of West Monroe, Louisiana, in the heart of the Great Depression. Born in 1921, Webb grew up in a world where poverty was not a temporary condition. It was the air you breathed. His father was a wandering farmer, moving the family from place to place, chasing just enough work to survive. It was a childhood of instability, of deprivation, of watching your parents struggle for every scrap. But there was music. His mother, a devoted fan of the new country sounds that were coming through the radio, played guitar and sang. She filled their modest home with songs by the Carter family, and most importantly, Jimmie Rodgers. She taught young Webb his first chords on a cheap Stella guitar, and in those tunes he found an escape. Music was more than entertainment. It was the promise of another world, a world beyond the cotton fields and the constant worry etched on his parents' faces. As a teenager, he showed signs of the ambition that would define his life. He got his own 15-minute radio show on KMLB in Monroe called Webb Pierce on his guitar. It was a small taste of the spotlight, but it was enough. He was hooked. He saw music not just as an art form, but as a business, a ticket to escape. This was not the soulful, tortured art of a Hank Williams. This was the calculated ambition of a young man who had known poverty and was determined to do whatever it took to leave it behind forever. After serving in the Army during World War II, Webb returned home with a burning impatience. He took a job in the men's shoe department at a Sears Roebuck store in Shreveport, Louisiana. By day he sold shoes, but by night he built his career. He and his new wife Audrey lived and breathed his musical ambitions. He played at local clubs, honed his distinctive nasal singing style, and kept on moving. He was always moving. His big break came not in Nashville, but in Shreveport, at the studios of radio station KWKH. The station was home to the Louisiana Hayride, the second most important country music program in America, dubbed the Cradle of the Stars. It was where Hank Williams became a legend and where, years later, a young Elvis Presley would get his start. In 1949, Webb Pierce negotiated a job at the Hayride. He wasn't just a performer, he was a relentless self-promoter. He founded his own record label, Pacemaker Records, with Hayride station manager Horace Hoss Logan. He hosted his own shows, recruited local talent. He wasn't just performing, he was building a local empire, learning the business from the ground up. His performances on the Hayride were explosive. He had a stage presence that couldn't be ignored. Dressed in flashy suits, he was a ball of energy, his soaring voice booming through the auditorium. He signed with Decca Records in 1951, and the hits started rolling in. First came Wondering, a song that would become his signature song, and then That Heart Belongs to Me. Nashville, the ultimate prize, was listening. In 1952, Webb Pierce packed his bags and moved to the capital of country music. He was invited to join the cast of the Grand Ole Opry, a lifelong dream come true. But Webb wasn't content to just be a member. He was there to dominate, and for a while he did. The mid-1950s belonged to Webb Pierce. He was an unstoppable force. From 1952 to 1956, He was the most successful country artist in the world without equal. He had 48 chart singles, 39 of which reached the top 10, and 26 of which reached number 1. He had a 13-week chart hit with In the Jailhouse Now, and followed it up with a string of chart-topping hits like Slowly, More and More, and I Don't Care. His version of There Stands the Glass became a classic country drinking song, a staple on the jukebox in every honky-tonk bar from Texas to Tennessee. His sound was pure, unadulterated honky-tonk. It was music for bars and dance floors, full of strummed steel guitar, walking bass lines, and Webb's unmistakable razor-sharp vocals. He was not an innovator in the way that his contemporaries Ray Price or Chet Atkins were. He found a formula that worked, and he stuck to it with a stubbornness that was both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. He gave the public what they wanted, and what they wanted was Webb Pierce. As his fame exploded, so did his flamboyance. He embraced the nudie cone school of stage dress, ordering suits that were more daring than anything seen before. They were covered in rhinestones, intricate embroidery, and symbols of success. He was no longer just a singer, he was a brand, and he was determined to turn his entire life into the ultimate advertisement for that brand. This is where Webb Pierce's story shifts from a rags to riches tale to a study in kitsch, almost comic excess. Money poured in faster than he could count, and he was determined to show it off. He bought a large house in a respectable neighborhood in Nashville and immediately began turning it into a monument to himself. His first and most famous project was his swimming pool. In 1962, he built a giant 40 by 75-foot pool in his front yard in the exact shape of a guitar. It was an act of pure, unadulterated ostentation. The pool instantly became a landmark. Webb, always the businessman, recognized its commercial potential. He opened his home to the public, encouraging tour buses to pass by. He would come out to greet tourists, sign autographs, and enjoy the attention. It is estimated that more than 3,000 tourists a week visited his home. He didn't just live in Nashville, he was turning his life into one of the city's biggest tourist attractions. His neighbors, of course, were horrified. They lived in a quiet, upscale community, and suddenly their streets were clogged with diesel-smoked tour buses and crowds of curious fans day and night. They sued him. This legal battle was about more than just noise and traffic. It was a culture clash for the future of Nashville. To Webb, the pool was a symbol of the country-style American dream, a poor boy who had made it big and was now sharing his success with his fans. He saw himself as the city's greatest attraction, but to his wealthy neighbors, he was a gaudy nouveau riche, turning their quiet street into a cheap carnival. Ironically, the man who saw himself as the king of Nashville was being sued by the elite of his own kingdom for tarnishing it. The legal battle dragged on for years, becoming a local soap opera. Webb fought back with everything he had, seeing it as an attack on his success. To him, the pool was a symbol of all he had accomplished. To his neighbors, it was a ridiculous nuisance. Eventually, the courts sided with the neighbors, and the tours were forced to stop. Webb was furious, feeling betrayed by the city he had helped make a name for himself. But the pool was just the beginning. His cars were even more legendary. He ordered 2 Pontiac Bonnevilles customized by Nudie Cone himself. These were more than just cars. They were mobile shrines to his ego. The first, a 1962 convertible, was lined with more than 1,500 real silver dollars. The door handles were pistols, the gear shift was a rifle, and a giant set of bullhorns was mounted on the front grille. The interior was covered in hand-carved leather. The second car was even more elaborate. They were absurd, over the top, and utterly unforgettable. Each glittering silver dollar glued to the dashboard wasn't just a coin. It was the ghost of a meal missed in childhood, a defiant declaration against the poverty that had once haunted him. He didn't just want to be rich. He needed people to see his wealth, a wealth so gaudy and loud that no one could possibly ignore it, least of all himself. He would drive them around town, a king surveying his kingdom from a silver-plated throne. These public displays of wealth were extensions of his personality. Behind the scenes, he was known as a shrewd, often ruthless businessman. Remembering the poverty of his youth, he was obsessed with financial security. He and Opry manager Jim Denny co-founded Cedarwood Publishing, which became one of the most powerful music publishers in Nashville. He bought up radio stations across the country. He made money not just from his own records, but from the entire music industry machine. However, his brash personality and ruthless business practices made him enemies, as well as admirers in the industry. He was notoriously stingy. Stories circulated of his fights with sidemen over pay. His ego was enormous. He saw himself not just as a star, but as the only star, and he demanded to be treated as such. This arrogance led to the most significant professional fallout of his career. At the absolute zenith of his power, Webb Pierce was fired from the Grand Ole Opry. The reasons have been debated for years. Officially, he refused to pay the Opry's booking department its standard agent's commission. Unofficially, many whispered that the institution had simply grown tired of his colossal ego and his refusal to be a team player. Whatever the reason, the split was a shocking act of defiance. The undisputed rhinestone-encrusted king of 1950s country music, a man who had clawed his way from poverty to build a business empire and turn his very home into a tourist attraction, had been cast out by Nashville's most sacred institution, yet consumed by an ego as vast as his fortune. Webb Pierce believed he was untouchable. He was bigger than the Opry, and for a moment it seemed he might be right. But in his arrogance, he failed to see the storm gathering on the horizon. A storm that would not only change country music forever, but would leave him stranded as a relic on the shores of his own success. The world of country music was beginning to shift beneath his feet. The raw, beer-soaked honky-tonk sound that he had perfected was starting to sound old-fashioned to the ears of a new, more suburban audience. From the recording studios on Nashville's Music Row, a sleeker, more polished sound was emerging. It was called the Nashville sound, a blend of country and pop engineered by visionary producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley. They smoothed out the rough edges, replacing the crying steel guitars and fiddles with lush string arrangements, orchestral backdrops, and smooth background vocals. Artists who embraced this new sound were rewarded with massive crossover success. Jim Reeves went from a country singer to an international crooner. Patsy Cline's recordings became timeless pop standards. Even Webb's old rival, Ray Price, who had once been as hardcore a honky-tonker as they come, had brilliantly adapted. Price developed his famous Ray Price Shuffle, a 4/4 beat with a walking bass line that modernized the honky-tonk sound, making it danceable and sophisticated. It kept him at the top of the charts for decades. Webb Pierce, however, watched this polished wave crest over Music Row and refused to change, digging his heels in with the stubborn force of a man defending his very identity. To his ears, the Nashville sound was an unforgivable sin. It stripped the music of its soul, replacing the cry of the steel guitar and the saw of the fiddle, the sounds of the beer joint and the broken heart, with lush, syrupy string arrangements and velvety background vocals better suited for a suburban living room. He viewed the trend and the artists who eagerly embraced it with a deep and unwavering contempt. While producers at Decca Records undoubtedly showed him the staggering sales figures of his crossover-friendly peers, pushing him toward this new commercial goldmine, he drew his line in the sand, in a stand that was part artistic integrity and part sheer, uncut arrogance. He famously declared, "I'm not going to record with a bunch of violins. I'm going to stay country." It was more than a statement. It was the defiant roar of a king standing on the battlements of his castle, refusing to acknowledge that the tide of history was washing its foundations away. He built a wall to protect his kingdom of Honky-Tonk, not realizing he was only trapping himself in the past. In the rapidly changing world of music, it wasn't just a bad decision, it was commercial suicide. Slowly but surely, his grip on the charts began to loosen. The number one hits that had once been a foregone conclusion dried up, replaced by modest top 20 entries, and then eventually they disappeared altogether. The radio stations that had once played his songs on a continuous loop now favored the smoother sounds of the new generation. The star that had burned so brightly was beginning to fade. His public persona, once seen as charmingly flamboyant, began to look dated and slightly garish. As the counterculture of the 1960s took hold, his rhinestone suits and silver dollar cars seemed like artifacts from a distant, tackier past. He became a symbol of the old guard, the very Nashville establishment that the new outlaw movement, led by figures like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, was actively rebelling against. To them, Webb Pierce represented everything that was wrong with Music City: the cheesy costumes, the commercialism, the formulaic sound. He had gone from being the era's biggest star to its most prominent caricature. Though Webb Pierce continued to tour, the glory had faded, now reduced to smaller stages in casinos and performances for a loyal but aging fan base. His bitterness was growing. He felt betrayed by the industry he had helped build, abandoned by the city whose skyscrapers were partly built on his business empire. The once reigning king of Nashville was now an outsider in his own town, a ghost hovering at a party to which he was no longer invited. At his Nashville mansion, the silence was now torture. The diesel roar of tour buses, the laughter and clicking of cameras from thousands of fans were gone forever. Instead, there was an eerie silence. The guitar-shaped pool, once the stage for his unparalleled success, now resembled a cold, watery grave, the burial place of a fading reputation. The image of Webb Pierce smiling and waving to the crowds had been replaced by an increasingly irritable man, pacing the vast grounds alone. He became increasingly reclusive, retreating behind the iron gates of the fortress he had built. Imprisoned in his own legend and increasingly desperate for oblivion, he was surrounded by the monuments he had erected to himself: silver-plated cars, glittering suits, but now they seemed to mock him in their silence. The polished persona he had carefully crafted had become his cage. And then one quiet night, that pent-up anger exploded. A gunshot rang out, tearing apart the false peace of the wealthy neighborhood. It was not a robbery, but an act of utter helplessness. Webb Pierce had opened fire on his own pool house. He was a lonely, angry king, firing at the walls of his own fortress. He wasn't just shooting at a building, he was lashing out at his own fading legacy. The fortress, built to protect him from the outside world, had become his prison, and he was the only prisoner inside. In the early 1980s, he attempted a comeback, but it failed to gain any real traction. The music industry had moved on too far. He was a living legend, yes, but a legend whose time had passed. In 1991, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He fought the disease for the last few years of his life, passing away in February of 1991 at the age of 69. When he died, The obituaries all dutifully mentioned his staggering number of hits, his incredible success in the 1950s, and, of course, they all mentioned the guitar-shaped pool and the silver dollar cars. In the final telling of his story, the spectacle had overshadowed the song. Musically, Webb Pierce's influence is profound and undeniable. He was one of the most important and defining voices of the entire honky-tonk era, with a signature high, lonesome tenor sound that would set the standard for decades to come. His extensive catalog of hits became the soundtrack for a generation and influenced countless future singers, from legends like George Jones to modern traditionalists like Dwight Yoakam. However, his larger significance lies not just in his music, but in his life story, which serves as one of Nashville's most potent and enduring cautionary tales. It's the story of a poor boy from Louisiana who rose from absolute poverty to achieve the American dream on an almost unimaginable scale. Through sheer talent and a relentless, unyielding determination, he became a millionaire, a business tycoon, and the biggest star in his field. But his story is also a tragic reminder of how the virtues that build a career can curdle into the vices that destroy a life. The deep insecurities of his past fueled his ambition, but they also led to his downfall. His stubborn refusal to evolve musically, which he likely saw as loyalty to the sound that made him famous, ultimately led to him becoming obsolete and irrelevant in a changing industry. At the same time, his desperate need to flaunt his immense wealth, a clear overcompensation for his impoverished childhood, alienated him from the very community and peers whose respect he craved. In the end, Webb Pierce died a lonely man, surrounded by the gaudy symbols of a fame that had long since faded. The king of Honky-Tonk became a forgotten exile in the very kingdom he had built for himself. His life is a powerful lesson. A true legacy isn't measured in silver dollars or swimming pools, but in lasting connection. Webb Pierce had all the trappings of success, but in the end, he lost his connection to the music and the audience, which is the only thing that truly matters. Thanks for joining us for this look back at a country music legend. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of fascinating figures from the past. We'll see you next time.